If you think the coming recession is going to be short and shallow like this, you're delusional. Most commentators are agreeing that yes, we'll see a recession, but it will be short-lived, then followed by some strong growth, which means the good times will be back. But is this all fanciful wishing, similar to the Fed's woeful forecast that inflation will only be transitory? Just like central banks kept getting it wrong with inflation, this short-lived recession forecast might be way off as well. I'm Biko Konstantinos, and it's a pleasure to have you. Why is everyone so afraid of a recession? Well, recessions normally have a negative financial impact on people's lives. You'll often have a falling stock market and rising unemployment. So in real terms, people will often lose some of their wealth, and more people start to struggle financially, especially due to unemployment. And because of this gloomy financial state, people tend to get tight or rein in their spending, which can have a domino effect because then businesses and companies will start to struggle as well. What is a recession? From this CNN business article, a recession is a prolonged period of economic decline beginning when the economy peaks and ending when it bottoms out. Recessions are typically marked by an economy shrinking in back-to-back quarters. This is measured by gross domestic product, which is how much we are collectively buying and producing as a society. So if a country's gross domestic product or GDP falls in 2 consecutive quarters, then that would technically be called a recession. However, the White House has just recently come out with a statement saying that 2 consecutive quarters of falling GDP don't actually constitute a recession. Now, they may just be putting out this statement because we probably are going to see 2 consecutive quarters of falling GDP in the US. GDP for the first quarter fell 1.6%, and the second quarter figures are due out in the next couple of weeks. So it seems like countries will do everything they can to avoid being classed as in a recession. It's probably a foregone conclusion that a number of countries will technically enter a recession in the coming quarters. However, there's a big debate as to whether these coming recessions will be short and shallow or more severe, and the difference is actually quite critical. A short and shallow recession would mean some financial pain, but this would only be short-lived, and economic growth or much better financial times will come back quickly, and more people will start thriving financially again. So that looks like the best case scenario from where we currently sit. It would basically mean inflation would start to decrease quite quickly, but for those who do think this could just be a short temporary blip of pain, Wall Street's Dr. Doom says you're delusional if you think the coming recession is going to be short and shallow. Dr. Doom is Nouriel Roubini, who is a famed economist who called the 2008 financial crash. Roubini thinks we're going to have a severe recession and a severe debt and financial crisis based on a recent interview he had with Bloomberg. Now let's consider the reasons why he thinks that and see if they make sense. Roubini pointed to historically high debt ratios in developed nations worldwide, claiming that the percentage of debt to GDP in advanced economies is now at 420% and rising. The most up-to-date I could find is these charts from Axios, which showed that at the end of 2020, global debt was sitting at 281 trillion. And as a share of global GDP, that represented 356%. This chart shows that global debt really started soaring since about 2017. Now, as a percentage of GDP, it stayed flat for a few years because global growth was growing quite strongly. But you can see since 2020 when COVID hit, global debt compared to global GDP has surged exponentially. Now, Roubini's latest figure of 420% is probably accurate because debt remains super high and global GDP has actually been declining. So I think Roubini is right to be concerned by this massive global debt percentage compared to GDP. He also noted there are a lot of zombie corporations that have used the cheap debt that was available during the pandemic to build businesses that will never be scalable or profitable. So because debt's been so cheap, there could be a number of companies out there that were surviving just on fumes, as in they were just getting by. So now that interest rates are rising sharply, many of these businesses and companies could potentially go bust, and that can have a big flow-on effect to the economy at large. On top of that, Roubini said that households, governments and corporations were bailed out during COVID by the Fed's interest rate cuts and support from the federal government that will not be available during this economic downturn. So basically, we printed money like it's going out of fashion, national debt soared ridiculously, so now central banks don't have the luxury to just be able to stimulate the economy willy-nilly. With inflation soaring, they're now out of many of those traditional options that they previously used to stimulate the economy. In the 1970s, he noted that the US economy struggled to fight stagflation, but at that time, debt ratios were low, while after the GFC, there was a debt crisis, but inflation wasn't the issue at that time. But this time around, we have both a stagflationary environment and debt ratios that are historically high, and that's a recipe for disaster. Roubini argues that the stock market will underperform in this more challenging environment. He wrote that US stocks could fall 50% from their late 2021 peak. And late 2021 is when the everything bubble peaked. And I go into a lot more detail about it in this video here. Hey, talking about peaking, don't forget to like this video if you're enjoying it, and please consider subscribing to my channel. I'd love to have you on board. Now, a 50% drop from the peak would be massive. Let's see what that could look like. This is what it looks like on the S&P 500. The high was around 4,800, and a 50% drop would take it all the way to around 2,400, or around the same place we saw in the sharp COVID sell down. Unlike COVID, we're not seeing a sell everything type drop. We're actually seeing an orderly downtrend, which is what you see in a typical bear market. And because we are in a genuine bear market, they normally take quite some time to play out before a new bull market can begin. So what do you think? Do you think we could possibly see a 50% fall from those highs? If so, it's going to cause a massive amount of pain across the globe, because so much money is invested into the stock market and so much of people's wealth is invested in the stock market. So you would see an absolute deterioration of wealth. And when people start losing their wealth, they become very, very tight, very protective of what they've got left, because they start going into financial survival mode. And when that happens, spending can decrease dramatically, which affects business, which affects unemployment, and you can see a total destruction in the economy. Now, I'm not predicting that that will happen, but it is a possibility. Roubini's argument is that in a normal recession, global equities tend to fall around 35%, but he doesn't think this next recession will be normal because it will be both stagflationary and accompanied by a financial crisis. So that's why he's predicting that the stock market falls could be above 35% and up to 50%. What do you think? Short and shallow recession followed by growth in the economy? Or do you think Roubini might be right? Debt's gotten out of control, central banks can't just flood the economy with money and stimulus, and inflation is soaring, leading actually to a significant and severe recession that will see very significant falls in the stock market, in the housing market, which will then lead to higher unemployment and a very sharp reduction in consumer spending. Please leave me your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. I'm Biko Konstantinos, and I'll catch you in my next video.